Harlem, New York. 2:47 p.m. Saturday, October 15, 1958. The October heat clung to Lenox Avenue like a wet blanket. Children dodged between parked Cadillacs, their laughter echoing off brownstone stoops where women in floral dresses fanned themselves with church programs. The smell of fried chicken and collard greens drifted from open windows, mixing with exhaust fumes and the distant sound of Miles Davis bleeding from a second-floor radio. This was Bumpy Johnson's kingdom. Every corner, every numbers runner, every storefront operating under his invisible protection. At exactly 2:52 p.m., a cream-colored Buick Roadmaster pulled up outside Sylvia's restaurant on Malcolm X Boulevard. Vincent Vinny Photos Torino stepped out, adjusting his sharkskin suit and gold cufflinks. He was a mid-level enforcer for the Genovese family, a man who specialized in what the Italians called psychological warfare. In his briefcase sat a manila envelope containing 8 black and white photographs that would seal his fate and the fate of everyone connected to him. Inside Sylvia's, Bumpy sat alone in a corner booth, reading the Amsterdam news while nursing black coffee. He didn't look up when Torino approached. He never looked up first. That was the first rule of power. Torino slid into the booth uninvited, his cologne cutting through the smell of cornbread and catfish. He placed the envelope on the checkered tablecloth between them. The photographs spilled out like a deck of marked cards. Bumpy's daughter Ruthie leaving her nursing school in the Bronx, his wife Mame shopping at the A&P on 125th Street, his 7-year-old grandson playing stickball in front of their brownstone. Each image was a violation. Each frame was a threat wrapped in celluloid. Torino smiled the kind of arrogant smirk that comes from a man who believes himself untouchable. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more venom than a shout. "Your family looks real vulnerable, Bumpy, real exposed. Be a shame if something happened to them because you forgot who runs this city." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Bumpy Johnson finally looked up. His eyes were flat, empty, the kind of emptiness that comes before a hurricane makes landfall. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply folded his newspaper, stood up, and buttoned his suit jacket. As he walked past Torino, he paused. Just for a moment. Long enough to check his watch and say 6 words that would echo through organized crime history. "You have until 3 tomorrow afternoon." Torino laughed. He actually laughed, the sound sharp and grating in the restaurant's warmth. He told his associates later that the old man was finished, that Bumpy Johnson had been neutered by time and compromise. He made phone calls from a payphone on 125th Street. He drank expensive whiskey at a social club in Little Italy. He went home to his apartment on Mulberry Street feeling invincible. 24 hours and 13 minutes later, Vincent Torino would be found in 8 different locations across 3 boroughs. But he wouldn't be alone. The systematic elimination of everyone who had touched those photographs, everyone who had approved that surveillance, everyone who had dared to believe Bumpy Johnson's family could be threatened without consequences, would become the most brutal day in organized crime history. A purge so complete, so methodical, that the Genovese family would never speak his name again without crossing themselves. The story of how Vincent Torino and 7 others lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now, let's go back to Saturday, October 15th, 1958. By October 1958, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson occupied a position that defied every conventional rule of organized crime. For 15 years, he had maintained an arrangement with the Italian families that was built not on subordination, but on mutual recognition of sovereign territory. He controlled Harlem's numbers racket, the lifeblood of black organized crime, while simultaneously functioning as a community institution who paid rent for widows, funded funerals for murdered teenagers, and ensured that outside violence had consequences. The Italians controlled the ports, unions, and major heroin routes. Harlem, however, was Bumpy's jurisdiction. This wasn't cooperation born from weakness, it was a calculated tente that kept millions of dollars flowing while preventing the kind of war that destroyed profit margins. Vincent Vinny Foto's Torino represented everything dangerous about the new generation of Italian enforcers. At 32, he was ambitious, methodical, and fatally ignorant of the history that had shaped the current power structure. Torino specialized in psychological warfare, the art of breaking men without throwing a punch, photographs of children leaving school, detailed schedules of wives shopping for groceries, anonymous letters describing what could happen to elderly parents. His success rate had made him arrogant, but his fatal flaw was simple. He believed black gangsters operated on a different, lesser tier of organized crime. He saw Bumpy Johnson as a relic whose reputation was built on outdated stories, a man who had been domesticated by age and compromise. The decision to pressure Bumpy came from Anthony Tony Bender Strollo, the Genovese underboss who harbored ambitions that exceeded his intelligence. Strollo had been hearing complaints from younger soldiers who resented the arrangement with Harlem. They wanted a larger percentage of the numbers racket, arguing that Italian protection deserved greater compensation. More importantly, Strollo believed Bumpy had grown soft. The old enforcer hadn't killed anyone publicly in nearly 3 years. He attended community meetings, donated to churches, posed for photographs with local politicians. To men who only understood fear and numbers, this looked like weakness. The surveillance operation was methodical and invasive. Mickey Brennan, a freelance photographer who had worked police surveillance before corruption and gambling debts pushed him into mob service, was hired to document Bumpy's family for 3 weeks. He photographed Ruthie Johnson leaving her nursing program at Bronx Community Hospital. He captured Mame Johnson shopping at the A&P on 125th Street every Wednesday morning. He stalked Bumpy's 7-year-old grandson playing stickball on West 147th Street, documenting the child's routine with military precision. The photographs were developed at Brennan's Midtown studio, then delivered to Torino through Tommy Ricci, a low-level Genovese courier. Detective Frank Costigan, a corrupt NIPTA lieutenant on the family payroll, provided movement schedules and security details. The chain of command was clear. Costigan gathered intelligence, Brennan documented it, Ricci delivered it, and Torino weaponized it. When Torino slid those photographs across the table at Sylvia's, his words carried layers of racist contempt he didn't bother to hide. He called Bumpy's family vulnerable and exposed coded language suggesting they lacked the protection that white families enjoyed. His smirk communicated what his words didn't, that black life, even the family of Harlem's most powerful man, could be violated without real consequences. Torino fundamentally misunderstood that Bumpy's power didn't come from Italian tolerance. It came from a network so deep and loyal it functioned as its own government. Bumpy's 24-hour deadline wasn't arbitrary. In street justice, it represented the exact time needed to activate his entire network, gather intelligence, and execute a response so comprehensive it would prevent future violations. Public disrespect required public consequences. At 3:15 p.m., Bumpy walked to Sylvia's payphone and spoke 5 words that would change everything. Activate the list. Everything burns. Across Harlem, the machinery of retribution awakened. Bumpy Johnson's true power never resided in the guns his men carried or the fear his reputation generated. His strength came from an information infrastructure that functioned like a shadow government woven into New York's fabric. Corrupt police officers traded case files for cash-filled envelopes. Telephone operators at the Manhattan Exchange diverted calls and traced numbers for weekly payments. Business owners from barbershops to funeral homes served as observation posts where conversations were cataloged and loyalties were purchased. Street soldiers controlled corners, but more importantly, they controlled the flow of intelligence about who moved through those corners and why. This network didn't just span Harlem, it reached into every borough, creating a surveillance apparatus that made the FBI look amateur. Within minutes of Bumpy's activation call, 3 men received coded messages that triggered specific protocols. Red Raymond, his chief enforcer, was a former boxer who approached violence like a craftsman approaches woodwork, with precision and professional pride. He had killed his first man at 17 and developed a reputation for clinical brutality without emotional attachment. Quiet Eddie Thompson earned his nickname from speaking only in whispers, but his talent for intelligence gathering was legendary. He could extract information from terrified witnesses and compile dossiers that read like military surveillance reports. Numbers Willie coordinated the financial operations that funded everything, a mathematical genius who could calculate profit margins while simultaneously running multiple gambling operations across 2 boroughs. These weren't employees, they were extensions of Bumpy's will. The intelligence gathering began with systematic precision that impressed even corrupt police officials. Telephone operators traced every call made from the Revanite Social Club in the past 72 hours, identifying patterns and frequent contacts. Street soldiers positioned outside known Genovese establishments documented vehicle movements, noting license plates and passenger details. Business owners who owed Bumpy favors suddenly remembered seeing specific faces in specific places at specific times. Within 90 minutes, Quiet Eddie had compiled a preliminary list of everyone connected to the surveillance operation, cross-referencing phone records with witness statements and financial transactions. Mickey Brennan's name surfaced first, a freelance photographer operating from a studio on West 42nd Street. Brennan was a former police surveillance specialist who had been forced out due to gambling debts and corruption charges. Detective Frank Costigan appeared next, his involvement confirmed through phone records showing meetings with known Genovese associates. Tommy Ricci, the courier who delivered the envelope to Sylvia's, was identified through vehicle registration and known association with Vincent Torino. The chain of command became clear through methodical investigation that revealed every link in the conspiracy. At his Edgecombe Avenue apartment, Bumpy spread intelligence reports across his dining room table like a general studying battlefield maps. There was no anger, no emotional reaction to his family's violated privacy. This was pure calculation, the methodical planning of a man who understood that revenge without strategy was just violence, and violence without purpose was weakness. He created a list with 8 names, each representing a link in the chain that had threatened his family. Next to each name, he wrote a specific time, not when they would die, but when they would be located, isolated, and eliminated. Mickey Brennan became the first target because he was both vulnerable and symbolic. At 4:47 p.m., as Brennan locked his studio door, he heard footsteps in the stairwell. Red Raymond emerged holding an ice pick. By 5:15 p.m., every negative was destroyed and a note was pinned to Brennan's chest. 1 down. 7 to go. Touch 1 Johnson. Lose everything. Vincent Torino spent his evening exactly as a man behaves when he believes in his own invincibility. At the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street, he held court at a corner table, expensive Macallan scotch in one hand and a cigarette in the other, surrounded by younger soldiers who treated his every word as gospel. The envelope incident at Sylvia's had already transformed into legend in his telling. He called Bumpy Johnson the Harlem has-been, describing how the old man had walked away without even raising his voice, how silence proved weakness rather than restraint. Each retelling grew more embellished, more dismissive. In Torino's version, Bumpy's calm ultimatum sounded pathetic, the hollow threat of a relic who didn't understand that real power had shifted downtown to men who weren't afraid to cross racial boundaries. While Torino drank and bragged, Bumpy's network moved with systematic precision across 3 boroughs. Quiet Eddie Thompson coordinated surveillance teams tracking every person connected to the photograph conspiracy. Detective Frank Costigan was located finishing his shift in Queens. Tommy Ricci was identified eating late dinner at a Bronx diner. Anthony Marino, the Genovese soldier who personally approved the surveillance operation, was tracked to his Brooklyn apartment. Each target was isolated, their movements cataloged, their vulnerabilities assessed. The network functioned like a military operation, processing intelligence and positioning assets with ruthless efficiency that made federal agencies look amateur. Bumpy's philosophy had been forged through decades of street warfare and political survival. He understood that eliminating Torino alone would accomplish nothing except temporary satisfaction. True deterrence required sending a message so devastating it would prevent future violations for generations. You don't just punish the hand that strikes you, you remove the entire arm, then display it publicly as a warning. This wasn't personal revenge, though the violation of his family made it deeply personal. This was institutional enforcement of boundaries that protected not just his bloodline, but every family operating under his protection. Weakness invited aggression. Disproportionate response created lasting respect. At 9:30 p.m., Detective Frank Costigan was discovered slumped in his unmarked police vehicle in a Queens parking lot. Both hands were systematically broken, each finger snapped with surgical precision. His badge was stuffed in his mouth, a grotesque symbol of corrupted authority. The note pinned to his uniform read, "2 down." Justice doesn't wear a uniform. The message was unmistakable. Police protection meant nothing when you violated the wrong family. At 11:45 p.m., Tommy Ricci vanished from a Bronx diner where he'd been finishing a late meal. Witnesses remembered 2 men sitting at the counter, paying in cash, leaving without conversation. Ricci walked to his car and never returned home. The vehicle was found the next morning with keys in the ignition, wallet untouched, and another note on the dashboard, 3 down. Delivery complete. Panic spread through Little Italy like infection through an open wound. Phone calls flooded Tony Bender Strollo's residence as associates reported the systematic discoveries. Strollo finally understood the catastrophic miscalculation. He attempted to call Bumpy directly, then through intermediaries, then through neutral parties who maintained relationships with both organizations. Every call went unanswered. Bumpy Johnson wasn't interested in negotiation or explanation. The time for conversation had expired at 3 p.m. midnight past while Torino remained at the social club, still laughing, still drinking, completely insulated from the systematic destruction of everyone connected to his operation. His confidence remained absolute, built on years of successful intimidation and the belief that Italian organizational superiority made him untouchable. At 12:03 a.m., the phone behind the bar rang. The bartender, face suddenly pale, handed Torino the receiver. He answered with swagger intact. A voice he didn't recognize delivered 5 words that shattered his reality. "Mr. Johnson wants you to know your time is up. What happens next is on you." The line went dead. Torino's smile finally faded as he looked around the room and realized he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. From 12:03 a.m. to 8:00 a.m., Bumpy Johnson's philosophy of smart violence unfolded with surgical precision across 3 boroughs. This wasn't chaotic retaliation or emotional revenge. It was institutional enforcement designed to eliminate threats while preventing the kind of messy war that destroyed profit margins and invited federal attention. Each target represented a calculated removal, timed and structured to send a message that would echo through every social club and backroom meeting in organized crime history. Anthony Little Tony Marino became Target 4 at precisely 1:30 a.m. He was the Genovese soldier who had personally approved the surveillance operation, signing off on photographing Bumpy's wife, daughter, and grandson as if they were ordinary leverage in a routine shakedown. Red Raymond and 2 associates entered his Brooklyn apartment through the fire escape, while Marino's wife and 3 children slept in adjacent rooms. The violence was brutal but surgically contained. Marino was eliminated in his study without a sound escaping to wake his family. They discovered the body hours later, but remained physically untouched, a deliberate choice that demonstrated Bumpy's moral code. Children and wives weren't targets. Only the men who made decisions faced consequences. The psychological trauma was intentional, creating witnesses who would spread the story while preventing the kind of family vendettas that escalated conflicts into wars. At 3:15 a.m., James Sullivan, the surveillance team leader and former military photographer, was extracted from his Queens home. Sullivan had coordinated the 3-week stalking operation, believing his technical expertise and Italian protection made him untouchable. His expensive camera equipment was systematically destroyed before the final act, every lens shattered, every negative burned, every photograph reduced to ash. The elimination was swift and professional. A note pinned to his body read, 5 down. No more pictures. Sullivan's reputation as a reliable contractor was obliterated alongside his life. No future client would hire a photographer whose work resulted in this kind of response. Bumpy's strategic brilliance became evident in how each elimination prevented rather than invited retaliation. The hits were clean, leaving no witnesses except traumatized family members who understood the rules had been violated first. Each message was clear about cause and consequence. The Genovese family found itself paralyzed because they couldn't assess the depth of Bumpy's network. How did he locate targets so quickly? How did his people move through multiple boroughs without detection? The uncertainty created strategic paralysis. Retaliation required understanding your enemy's capabilities, and Bumpy had just demonstrated capabilities that exceeded every estimate. Financial warfare erupted simultaneously with physical elimination. Torino's illegal gambling operation in the Bronx was raided by unknown assailants who knew exact locations of cash reserves and betting records. His loan shark business was systematically dismantled through targeted violence against collectors and direct warnings to debtors that their obligations were canceled. Hidden cash reserves, discovered through intelligence Quiet Eddie had gathered over weeks, were located and redistributed to Harlem community organizations. Churches received anonymous donations. Youth programs found envelopes of cash. Bumpy was simultaneously destroying an enemy and reinforcing his reputation as community protector. The psychological impact on Torino was devastating and calculated. Throughout the early morning hours, panicked phone calls reached him every 90 minutes with another report. Someone missing, someone found, another operation destroyed. He wasn't just being hunted, his entire financial empire was being systematically erased while he watched helplessly. At 4:30 a.m., he fled Manhattan with his cousin Marco, driving frantically toward a safe house in Fort Lee, New Jersey, believing state lines would provide protection from Bumpy's reach. Tony Bender-Strollo made increasingly desperate attempts to negotiate through neutral parties. He offered financial compensation that would have made any other gangster wealthy. He promised to discipline Torino personally, even suggested turning him over to Bumpy directly. Every offer was met with the same response: silence. Bumpy's organization refused to acknowledge intermediaries or engage in dialogue. The lesson had to be total and uncompromising. At 7:47 a.m., as dawn broke over New York, Bumpy sat in his Edgecombe Avenue apartment drinking black coffee and reading the morning paper as if nothing unusual was happening. The phone rang once. Red Raymond's voice came through, steady and professional. The last two are located. Jersey Safe House. They're trapped. Bumpy checked his watch, 19 hours and 34 minutes since the threat was made. He was ahead of schedule. The Fort Lee Safe House was compromised through systematic intelligence gathering that demonstrated the futility of geographical escape from Bumpy Johnson's network. Quiet Eddie Thompson's informants at George Washington Bridge toll booths had recorded license plates, while corrupted telephone operators traced every call Torino made from New Jersey payphones back to Manhattan numbers. The location itself, a modest two-story house perched on cliffs overlooking the Hudson River, offered panoramic views of Manhattan that would become symbolic of Torino's fatal miscalculation. He could see the city he believed he controlled, but distance provided no protection from consequences he had invited. Red Raymond and 3 associates arrived at 9:30 a.m., parking 2 blocks away and approaching through residential streets where their presence wouldn't trigger alarm. They carried no firearms. This elimination required personal proximity and symbolic messaging that bullets couldn't deliver. The weapons were ice picks and brass knuckles, tools that demanded intimate violence and ensured Torino would understand this wasn't business conducted from distance, but personal consequences for personal violations. Inside the safe house, Torino stood at the living room window with binoculars, watching Harlem across the river as if studying enemy territory. His cousin Marco sat at the kitchen table cleaning 2 pistols, both men armed, both terrified, both experiencing the dawning realization that Italian organizational structure meant nothing when you violated rules older than any syndicate. Marco had provided logistics support for the surveillance operation, making him complicit in Bumpy's calculus where complicity carried identical weight to direct action. The confrontation began at 10:15 a.m., when Red Raymond entered through the rear entrance with terrifying efficiency. Marco was eliminated first by design, removing the closest ally before the main target intensified psychological terror and stripped away any illusion of backup or rescue. The violence was swift, brutal, and intentionally visible to Torino, who turned from the window to witness his cousin's final moments and understand with absolute clarity that no bargaining would change his fate. Cornered against the window overlooking Manhattan, Torino broke completely. The arrogant enforcer who had smirked at Bumpy in Sylvia's restaurant vanished, replaced by a desperate man bargaining for seconds of life. He offered money in amounts that would have funded Harlem operations for years, naming hidden stashes in Queens and safe deposit boxes in Little Italy. He promised information about Genovese's family operations, revealing names and locations with frantic urgency. He offered territory, promised permanent disappearance, even suggested his own family's lives as collateral for mercy that would never come. Red Raymond listened without expression until Torino exhausted his desperate catalog of bargains. Then, he delivered Bumpy's message verbatim in a voice devoid of emotion. You touched his family. You disrespected his name. You laughed when you should have run. The execution was constructed for maximum symbolic impact. Torino was forced to destroy the remaining surveillance equipment with his own hands, smashing cameras, tearing photographs, obliterating the tools he'd used to violate Bumpy's family. Each shattered lens became an act of forced confession. Then he was positioned facing the window, forced to stare at Manhattan's skyline, at Harlem visible across the river. His final view was of the territory he'd tried to intimidate, the community he'd underestimated, the kingdom he'd disrespected. By 11:15 a.m., both men were dead. Their bodies were placed in Torino's cream-colored Buick Roadmaster and driven back across state lines, back through Manhattan traffic, back to the exact location where this had begun. At exactly 2:47 p.m., 24 hours to the minute after Torino made his threat, the Buick was parked outside Sylvia's restaurant with the trunk left open. Police discovered not just the bodies, but all surveillance equipment and documentation that implicated the entire Genovese operation. A final note on the windshield read, 8 down. The lesson is permanent. This is Bumpy's Harlem. The immediate fallout rippled through New York's underworld with absolute silence that spoke louder than any retaliation. The Genovese family, renowned for ruthless efficiency, found itself paralyzed by a counter-offensive that had dismantled an entire operation in 24 hours. Their response wasn't violence, it was damage control wrapped in humiliation. 3 days after the bodies were discovered outside Sylvia's restaurant, Tony Bender-Strollo requested a meeting through neutral intermediaries, understanding that his organization had crossed a line that demanded immediate diplomatic resolution. The meeting occurred in a Harlem barbershop on 125th Street, lasting exactly 7 minutes and representing the complete inversion of traditional power dynamics. Strollo arrived without bodyguards, carrying an envelope containing $50,000 in reparations for the disrespect. He placed the money on the table between them, a gesture that acknowledged fault while attempting to purchase forgiveness. Bumpy didn't touch the envelope. He didn't even look at it. He accepted nothing except a verbal promise that the boundaries of Harlem were now absolute, and that no Italian family would ever again consider his family legitimate targets for intimidation. Strollo left with his money but without his dignity, understanding that the hierarchy of organized crime had fundamentally shifted. In Harlem streets, the story of the 24-hour purge transmuted instantly from news into mythology. Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a respected gangster. He had become a force of nature who could erase bloodlines before sunset. The narrative spread through every borough, retold in social clubs and barbershops with details that grew more elaborate with each telling. New recruits in every crime family heard the tale as cautionary instruction about boundaries that couldn't be crossed regardless of organizational backing or racial assumptions. The photographs that were meant to demonstrate vulnerability instead became symbols of catastrophic miscalculation, teaching young soldiers that threatening Bumpy Johnson's family wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. The personal cost to Bumpy remained invisible to everyone except those closest to him. His wife Mame later recalled weeks of sleepless nights where he sat at their kitchen table drinking coffee until dawn, processing the weight of 8 lives ended because someone photographed his grandson playing stickball. His philosophy had always been that violence served strategic purpose, that brutality without objective was weakness disguised as strength. He didn't want this systematic elimination, didn't celebrate the destruction of men following orders from superiors. But his world operated on immutable logic, weakness invited aggression, and aggression against family required disproportionate response that prevented future violations. The protection this act provided lasted the remainder of his life. For the next decade until his death in 1968, no one dared threaten Bumpy Johnson's family again. The Italians maintained respectful distance, treating Harlem as sovereign territory rather than subordinate operation. Police who had previously considered him a vulnerable target suddenly gave him operational space, understanding that pushing too hard against a man willing to eliminate 8 people in 24 hours created more problems than it solved. His family moved through New York with invisible security purchased through institutional memory and absolute fear-based respect. Historically, this event represents a turning point in Black organized crime's relationship with Italian syndicates, proving definitively that respect was non-negotiable regardless of race. The photographs that Torino commissioned to expose vulnerability had achieved the exact opposite, illuminating the terrifying depth of Bumpy's network and the absolute finality of his judgment. 8 men participated in threatening Bumpy Johnson's family. 8 men learned that in the underworld there are rules older than law, codes more binding than blood, and consequences more severe than prison. Bumpy Johnson didn't just eliminate his enemies, he erased them so completely that their names became warnings whispered in social clubs from Harlem to Little Italy. 24 hours. 8 lives. One message that echoed through organized crime history: never touch the family.